She was 23 and completely broke. No family left, no roof she could call her own, and just a crumpled $10 bill at the bottom of a coat pocket that had seen 2 winters too many. No safety net, no second chances. Just one decision that made no sense at all. She spent her last $10 on an abandoned fishery, a rotting, collapsing, forgotten fishery on the edge of a gray Atlantic town that had been dying slowly for over 30 years. People didn't just doubt her. They laughed, said she'd be gone before the first tide turned, said buying that fishery was the fastest way to lose the little she had left. But what none of them knew, not the man who sold it to her, not the fisherman who watched her sign the papers, not the whole shrinking town that had written the place off decades ago, was that this abandoned fishery was hiding something. Something buried beneath the warped floorboards. Something sealed inside the rusted walls. Something that had been waiting there for a very long time. Something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. At 23, Emerson Hale wasn't just struggling. She was running out of everything at once. Her mother had passed a winter before, a short, merciless illness that swallowed what little savings the two of them had managed to put aside. Her father had already been gone a decade, lost at sea off the coast of Maine when Emerson was 13, and people in town still talk about him in low voices when they thought she wasn't listening. After her mother's funeral, the small apartment they had shared became impossible to hold on to. Rent notices piled up. The landlord was patient for a while, and then he wasn't. Emerson packed what she could into 2 duffel bags and walked out with nothing but the clothes on her back and a photograph of her parents standing on a dock, squinting into a sun that had set years ago. For 8 months she drifted. Motel rooms when she could scrape the money together. A cousin's couch in New Hampshire until the cousin's husband got tired of seeing her at breakfast. A shelter in Portland for 3 weeks that smelled of bleach and old coffee. She took every job she could find. Dishwashing, gutting fish on a processing line, stocking shelves at a hardware store, and every job ended the same way, with a layoff or a closed door, or a boss who finally admitted the business couldn't stay open. By the time she came back to the little coastal town of Harlow's Point, she had $42 to her name, a half tank of gas in a car older than she was, and a gnawing certainty that she had nowhere else to go. Harlow's Point was the only place on earth where her name still meant anything. Her grandfather, Silas Hale, had run a small fishery there for most of his life. Her father had worked those same docks as a boy. When her grandfather died, the fishery had been sold off cheap, or so she'd always been told, and the Hale family had drifted away from the water that had fed them for 3 generations. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We want to know who's traveling this story with us tonight. Emerson spent her last proper meal money on a plate of eggs at a diner on the main street, and that's where she saw the notice. Pinned to a corkboard by the door, under a faded flyer for a long-finished church bake sale, was a single sheet of paper that said, in ballpoint handwriting, for sale. Old Hale Fishery. $10 or best offer. C.J. MORROW at the HARBORMASTER'S. She read it 3 times before she was sure she wasn't hallucinating. $10. The place her grandfather had built with his own hands, where her father had learned to splice rope and read a tide chart, was being offered for the price of a cheap sandwich. She felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in months. Not hope, exactly. Something older and harder. Something that felt like the last dare her life was ever going to give her. She walked straight to the HARBORMASTER'S office. Jim Morrow was a man in his 70s with hands like cracked leather and eyes that had seen too many storms to lie easily. He looked her up and down when she said her name, and something shifted in his face. Recognition, maybe, or pity, or both. "You're Silas's granddaughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he slid a yellowed folder across the counter. "Buildings condemned. Roofs halfway gone. The pilings are soft. Town's been trying to get rid of it for years. Nobody will take it even at $10, because the cleanup costs more than the land's worth." He looked at her carefully. "You sure you want this, Em? This isn't a good investment. This is just trouble with a deed on it." "I know. Your grandfather wouldn't have wanted you stuck with it." She thought about that for a long time. Then she pulled the crumpled $10 bill out of her coat pocket and laid it flat on the counter and smoothed it with her palm until it lay there looking small and foolish between them. "My grandfather built it," she said. "That's the only reason I need." Jim Morrow looked at the money. He looked at her. Something in his face softened into something that wasn't quite a smile. He took the $10 and he slid the deed across the counter and he said, "Welcome home, kid." The first time Emerson stood on the rotting porch of her grandfather's fishery, she understood exactly what she had done. The building was worse than the photographs, worse than Jim Morrow had described. The main structure was a 2-story wooden shed that hunched against the wind like something ashamed. Half the roof had caved in years ago, and what remained was a patchwork of black tar paper and rusted nails. The windows were boarded with scraps of plywood that had warped and split in the salt air. The front door hung on a single hinge. The whole building leaned seaward, as if it were waiting politely for the next storm to finish the job. Below the building, the dock stretched out over a shallow tidal inlet. Splintered planks, missing boards, pilings furred green with decades of algae. The smell hit her first. Not the fresh, iodine smell of working salt water, but something older and sourer, rotting wood, dead kelp, something like mildew and something like memory. She stood there for a long time in the late September wind, and she thought, "What have I done?" She had no tools, no money, no plan. She had a condemned building and a deed in her pocket, and enough gas to drive away. And for a moment, just a moment, that's what she wanted to do. Drive away. Sleep in the car somewhere farther south. Pretend the $10 had bought her nothing at all. But she remembered her grandfather's hands. She remembered sitting on his lap when she was 6 years old, watching him mend a net in the sun, his fingers moving like he'd been born doing it. She remembered him telling her, in that slow, careful voice he used for important things, "A piece of land that's been worked by people who loved it is never really empty, Emmy. It holds what they put in. You just have to know how to look." She had always thought he was talking about gardens, or about sentiment, or about the kind of thing old men say because old men say them. Standing on that porch, she wasn't so sure anymore. She slept in her car the first night, wrapped in a wool blanket that still smelled faintly of her mother's apartment. The wind off the inlet rocked the car in slow, steady pushes, and somewhere in the dark, a loose piece of the fishery's tin roofing banged against itself in a rhythm that sounded almost like knocking. "Let me in," the wind seemed to say. "Let me in, and I'll tell you." She did not sleep well. By sunrise, she was back on the porch with a flashlight, a screwdriver from the glove compartment, and the kind of cold-fingered determination that only comes to people who have nowhere else to be. She wedged the door open. She stepped inside. The interior was worse than she expected, and somehow better too. The first room was a wreck, collapsed shelving, the remains of a wood stove tipped on its side, papers and rotted burlap, strewn across the floor like the aftermath of a retreat. But under the wreckage, when she scraped her boot across the floorboards, she could see that the wood was still good. Pine, she thought. Her grandfather had always said that pine would outlast you if you kept it dry. She could smell the sea coming up through the gaps. And she could smell something else, too. That old, woody, smoky smell that fisheries carried for generations. The smell of brine and of smoke and of lives stacked on top of each other until the walls themselves remembered. She spent that first day just clearing space. Not fixing, not planning, just clearing, hauling broken shelving out onto the scrub grass, stacking rotted planks in a pile for burning, sweeping decades of dust and mouse nesting out through the open door. Her hands bled by noon. Her shoulders screamed by 3. She drank water from the rusted spigot out back and ate half a granola bar she'd been saving since Portland. A few locals drifted by during the day. An older woman walking a dog stopped at the edge of the property and stared. 2 men in a pickup truck slowed almost to a stop, exchanged a look Emerson couldn't read, and drove on. Around 4 in the afternoon, an old man with a white beard and a fisherman's cap came walking up the gravel road with a thermos under his arm. He stood at the edge of the porch and watched her work for a full minute before he spoke. "You Silas Hale's granddaughter?" "Yes. I'm Thomas Whalen. Your grandfather and I used to run lines together." He set the thermos down on the porch rail. "Figured you might want something hot." Emerson didn't know what to say. She took the thermos, and she unscrewed the cap, and the steam that came out smelled like chicken broth, and she burst into tears right there on the porch in front of a man she had never met. It was the first kind thing a stranger had done for her in so long that her body didn't know how to receive it except by breaking. Thomas Whalen didn't say anything. He just stood there until she was done, and then he said quietly, "Your grandfather was one of the finest men I ever knew. And this building," he looked up at the sagging roof, "this building has secrets. You be careful with it, Emerson. You hear me?" She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "What kind of secrets?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, as if he were deciding not to say something. "The kind that don't get spoken about," he said finally. "Not in this town. Not for a long time." He tapped the porch rail twice, a slow, deliberate sound. "But you look around in there, girl. You look close. Your grandfather didn't sell this place. I'll tell you that much. Whatever paper says he did, he didn't." And then he turned and walked back down the gravel road, leaving the thermos behind and Emerson standing in the open doorway with her mouth slightly open and her chest too full of questions to breathe. That night, she could not sleep at all. She sat in the front room of the Fishery with a lantern she had bought for $4 at a gas station, and she turned Thomas Whalen's words over in her head until they wore smooth. Your grandfather didn't sell this place. She had always been told, by her mother, by the rare aunt who still called on holidays, that after her grandfather died, the Fishery had been sold off to cover debts. That was the story. That was the family's single sentence about the place. Sold to cover debts. But her grandfather had never carried debt. Her mother had said it more than once, with a note of quiet pride. Your granddaddy never owed anybody a dime, Emmy, not once in his life. So what debts, exactly, had the Fishery been sold to cover? The next morning she started searching. She didn't know what she was looking for. She only knew she was looking. She began in the office, a small back room behind the main floor, where her grandfather had kept his ledgers. The desk was still there, split down the middle by decades of damp, but the drawers held nothing but mouse-chewed receipts and a single cracked tide chart from 1988. The filing cabinet was empty. The walls were bare except for a faded calendar from a feed supplier long since out of business. She searched the main floor. She searched the loft. She searched the crawl space under the dock, crouching in cold mud with a lantern while crabs scuttled away from her light. She found nothing but the ordinary debris of an ordinary building left to rot. On the fourth day, she nearly gave up. She sat on the porch with the last of Thomas Whalen's broth. He had returned every afternoon now, always with thermos, never with more than a few words. And she stared out the inlet, and she thought, maybe it was just an old man remembering wrong. Maybe the story is the story. Maybe there's nothing here but a condemned building and my own desperation trying to turn it into more. But that night the wind came up hard off the Atlantic, and the Fishery groaned around her the way old wooden buildings do. And somewhere above her head, in the loft she had already searched twice, she heard a sound she had not heard before, a soft, hollow thud, the sound of something loose knocking against wood. She grabbed the lantern. She climbed the loft ladder, her heart already moving faster than her feet. The loft was empty. She had already cleared it, but the sound was still there, irregular, answering the wind. She traced it with a lantern, inch by inch, along the rafters and down the far wall. And there, behind a stack of old lobster traps she had shoved against the wall on the first day, she saw it, a section of wall paneling that had worked itself loose in the wind. It hung slightly crooked, and behind it, she could see the dark edge of something hollow, a space, a compartment built into the wall itself. Her hands were shaking when she pulled the panel away. It wasn't random. That was the first thing she understood. The compartment had been built on purpose, framed with careful hand-cut lumber, tucked between two roof beams in a way that no casual observer would ever notice. And inside the compartment, wrapped in wax canvas the color of old butter, was a bundle. She lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it down the ladder. She laid it on the workbench in the main room. She unwrapped it slowly, the way you unwrap something you're not sure you're allowed to see. Inside the canvas was a metal strongbox, old, hand-riveted, locked with a small brass padlock that had gone green with age. She stared at it for a long time. Her grandfather's box. She knew it the way you know a face you haven't seen in years. She had seen this box, or one just like it, sitting on his desk when she was 7 years old. She had asked him what was in it, and he had told her important things, Emmy, things for later. She had forgotten about it entirely until this moment. The padlock gave way under a claw hammer on the third try. The lid lifted with a soft, reluctant squeak. Inside, arranged with the same careful precision her grandfather had applied to every net he ever mended, were papers. A lot of papers. Deeds. Letters. A small leather-bound ledger. A yellowed envelope with her own name written across the front in her grandfather's handwriting. The letters slightly uneven, the ink faded but still legible. For Emerson, when she is ready. She sat down on the floor of the fishery, and she opened the envelope first. The letter inside was dated 11 years ago, written 2 months before her grandfather died. Emmy, it began. If you are reading this, then you came back. I hoped you would. I prayed you would, though I never was a man for much praying. There are things about this place your family was never told, and things I could not tell them while certain men were still alive to make trouble. But you are reading this now, which means enough time has passed, and you are old enough to understand. So I will tell you the truth. This fishery was never going to be sold to cover debts. I had no debts. What happened is that a group of men in this town wanted the water rights to this inlet, and the shoreline deed, and the old harvest license that runs with this building. Those rights were put in my family's name by the original charter of Harlow's Point in 1889, and they cannot be separated from the building and the land without the owner's signature. The men who wanted them could not buy me out, because I would not sell, so they waited. I am writing this because I am sick, Emmy, and I know what comes after. They will pressure your grandmother. They will pressure your mother. They will produce papers that look real, and they will tell a story about debts. And the family will be tired and grieving, and they will take the 10 cents on the dollar that is offered, and they will walk away. And those men will finally have what they waited for, but they will not have it, because the deed they will use to sell this place is not the true deed. The true deed, the original charter deed with the water rights and the harvest license attached, is in this box. I filed a duplicate with the county office in 1979, in your father's name and in yours after you were born. I did it quietly, through a friend at the registry. The men who came for me never knew, which means, Emmy, that whoever has been calling himself the owner of this place for the last 10 years has been owning a worthless piece of paper. The real deed, the real rights, the real claim to this inlet and this building and everything that runs with it. That is yours. It has always been yours. I know you may have been told I was a stubborn old man. Maybe I was, but I was stubborn about the right things. This water fed my father, and it fed me, and it fed your father. God rest him, and I would not let it be taken from the family by men who did not earn it. Take care of the place. Emmy, make it yours. And when you go to the county registry, ask for Mr. Peter Ansell. He is the one who helped me. If he is still alive, he will remember. If he is not, the paperwork is in the sealed gray envelope in this box, and it will speak for itself. I love you, Emmy. I always have. The water is yours now. Grandpa Silas. Emerson sat on the floor of the fishery with the letter in her lap, and she cried until she could not breathe. Not the small, held-back crying she had done over her mother's coffin. The other kind, the kind that leaves you hollowed out and clean. She cried for her grandfather and for her father and for the mother who had never known the truth, and she cried for the 23-year-old woman who had driven into this town 3 days ago with $10 in her pocket and not the faintest idea that the ground under her feet was already hers by right. When she was done, she picked up the ledger. The ledger confirmed everything. Harvest counts going back 40 years. Water rights citations. Copies of correspondence with the county registry. A list of names, carefully written in her grandfather's blocky handwriting. The names of the men who had approached him over the years, who had made their offers, who had threatened in polite coastal ways and impolite ones. Some of those names she recognized. One of them, in particular, she recognized very well. She picked up the sealed gray envelope and held it up to the lantern. Through the paper, she could see the faint outline of an official county seal. She sat there on the floor for a long time. Then she stood up, and she put everything back in the strong box, and she closed the lid, and she carried the strong box out to her car and locked in the trunk. She went back inside the fishery. She lay down on the sleeping bag she had spread across the clean pine floor. She stared up at the holes in the roof where the stars were coming through. For the first time in a long time, she was not afraid of the dark. If this story is moving you, hit the like button and turn on the bell so you never miss another story like this one. The next morning, she went to the county registry. The town of Harlow's Point kept its records in a squat brick building 2 streets back from the harbor. Emerson arrived when the doors opened. She wore the cleanest shirt she had, which was not very clean, and she carried the strong box in a canvas bag over her shoulder. She asked for Mr. Peter Ansel. The woman at the desk looked at her over the top of her glasses. Peter retired 8 years ago, honey, but he still lives in town. You need something from the registry. I can help you. I need to see the original charter deed for the Hale fishery, the 1889 deed with the water rights and the harvest license attached. The woman's pen stopped moving. She looked at Emerson a little longer. That's a very specific request. I know. Can I ask why? Because I'm the owner. The woman lowered her glasses. The owner of the fishery is a gentleman named Whitaker. Has been for about a decade. No, ma'am, he isn't, and I can prove it. Something shifted in the woman's face. Not disbelief, exactly, but a slow, watchful recognition that something unusual had walked into her morning. She stood up. She went to a back room. She came out with a large leather-bound book and a smaller metal file, and she laid them on the counter, and she said, "Show me." Emerson opened the strong box. She laid her grandfather's letter on the counter first, then the ledger, then, carefully, she broke the seal on the gray envelope and slid out the duplicate deed, the original registered county stamp charter deed from 1979, with her father's name on it and her own name added in 1982 as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. The woman at the counter read it. Then she read it again. Then she sat down very slowly in her chair. "Oh, my Lord," she said softly. "Oh, Silas, you old fox." She looked up at Emerson. "Honey, you need a lawyer. Right now. Today. I don't have money for a lawyer." "You don't need money. You need Peter Ansel. I'll call him myself. You sit right there." The man called Whitaker owned the cannery on the waterfront and sat on the town council and had his name on the sign of a real estate company that had quietly bought up most of the developable shoreline in Harlow's Point over the last 15 years. Emerson knew his name because it was in her grandfather's ledger 3 times, with dates, with dollar amounts, with notes in her grandfather's careful hand. Offered again. Declined. Pressure increasing. Peter Ansel arrived at the registry office in under an hour. He was 81 years old and walked a cane, and the moment he saw the strong box on the counter, he started to cry, which made Emerson cry again, which made the woman behind the counter reach for a box of tissues. "I always wondered," Peter Ansel said. "I always wondered if the day would come. Silas made me promise not to say a word unless you walked through that door yourself. He said you'd come when it was time. He said the water would bring you back." He wiped his eyes with a handkerchief that was not clean enough for the job. "What do you need, Emerson Hale? Because whatever it is, I'm going to help you get it." What happened next took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of quiet, careful, meticulous legal work, conducted mostly in Peter Ansel's living room over cups of tea that his wife kept refilling without being asked. 3 weeks of filing motions and sworn statements and certified copies. 3 weeks during which Emerson slept in the fishery on her sleeping bag, ate the soup Thomas Whalen brought every afternoon, and learned more about property law than she had ever imagined existed. The duplicate deed was valid. More than valid. It was the original. The deed that the man named Whitaker had been operating under for a decade was a quitclaim filed by a distant relative who had never actually held legal title to the property. The quitclaim had never been contested because no one in the family had known there was anything to contest. But a quitclaim conveys only whatever interest a grantor actually holds, and the grantor in this case had held none, which meant, legally, formally, unambiguously, that the fishery had never left the Hale family, that the water rights had never left the Hale family, that the harvest license, which in Harlow's Point had become extraordinarily valuable over the last 15 years as aquaculture leases tripled in price, had never left the Hale family. Emerson Hale was not a broke 23-year-old who had spent her last $10 on a condemned building. She was the sole legal owner of one of the most valuable pieces of coastal property in the county, and she had been since her 22nd birthday, when her father's share had passed to her by right of survivorship after her mother died. She had just never been told. The meeting happened on a cold, clear Thursday in October. It was held in the conference room of the town hall, at Peter Ansell's request, and Whitaker came because his lawyer told him he had to. He walked in wearing a charcoal overcoat, and the kind of confidence that a certain kind of man wears the way other men wear watches. He nodded at the town clerk. He nodded at the two selectmen who had agreed to serve as witnesses. He did not nod at Emerson. He looked at her the way you look at a draft under a door, briefly with mild irritation, without really seeing. Mr. Whitaker, Peter Ansell began, in the soft, careful voice of a man who had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. Thank you for coming. My client is Miss Emerson Hale, granddaughter of the late Silas Hale. We are here to discuss the ownership of the property commonly known as the Hale Fishery, the associated dock, the title Inlet Shoreline Deed, and the 1889 harvest license that runs with the property. Whitaker's lawyer, a man from a firm 2 towns over, folded his hands. My client is a recorded owner of that parcel and has been for a decade. I'm not sure what there is to discuss. There is a great deal to discuss, Peter Ansell said, because the recorded owner is not, and has never been, the legal owner. He opened the folder in front of him. He laid out the documents one at a time, the way a man lays cards on a table when he knows a hand is already won. The original 1889 charter deed, the 1979 duplicate filing in Emerson's father's name, the 1982 amendment adding Emerson as a joint tenant, the death certificates, the chain of survivorship, the handwritten letter from Silas Hale, dated 2 months before his death, witnessed and notarized by Peter Ansell himself, explaining everything he had done and why. Whitaker's lawyer read the documents. His face did not change, but his hands became very still. He leaned over and whispered something to Whitaker. Whitaker's face did change. "This is," he said and stopped. "This is some kind of fraud." "Mr. Whitaker," Peter Ansell said gently, "I notarized that letter myself. I filed the duplicate deed with this very office in 1979. Every signature on these documents is authentic. Every filing is contemporaneous. Every seal is this county's. I have served in the registry of this county for 43 years. I would stake my reputation on the authenticity of every page. I am, in fact, doing so right now." Whitaker stared at the papers. His mouth moved without sound. Then, slowly, something came apart in his face. The practiced smoothness of it, the confidence that had walked into the room in a charcoal overcoat. He looked, for a moment, not like a man who had owned most of a waterfront for 10 years. He looked like a man who had just realized that a door he had been walking through for a decade had never actually been as to open. "Silas," he said. The name came out of him almost involuntarily. That old. He did not finish the sentence. He looked at Emerson for the first time. Really looked. "You're her," he said. "You're his granddaughter." "I am." "You bought the building for $10. "I did." He laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was a laugh of a man who had just understood the scale of a joke at his own expense, one that had been set up 30 years before the punch line landed. $10, he said. $10 for 140 acres of shoreline and a harvest license that leases for $600,000 a year. That's what the notice said. He looked at her for a long time. Something passed behind his eyes that she could not entirely name. Anger, she thought, and something under the anger. Something older. Something like the fear of a man who has built a life on a foundation he always half suspected was not his. His lawyer leaned over and whispered him again. Whitaker did not respond. "Miss Hale," the lawyer said carefully, "my client would like to explore a settlement. A buyout. A generous one. We can have papers drawn by end of week." Peter Ansell smiled very slightly. "My client is not selling. Everything is for sale at some price." "Not this," Emerson said. It was the first time she had spoken, and every head in the room turned to her. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands folded on the table. Not to him. Not at any price. Whitaker's face tightened. "Little girl," he said, "you have no idea what you are walking into." "I have some idea," Emerson said. "I walked into this town 3 weeks ago with $10 and nothing else. I slept in a condemned building. I ate soup that a stranger brought me because he still remembered my grandfather. And I found out that for 10 years, a man in a nice coat has been making money off of land he had no right to touch, on rights he had no right to lease, on a harvest license that belongs to my family and always did." She took a breath. "So I have some idea what I'm walking into, Mr. Whitaker. I'm walking into what was mine the whole time." The room was very quiet. Peter Ansel cleared his throat. "My client will, of course, be filing for a full accounting of all revenue generated from the property during the period of wrongful possession, including all sublease income on the harvest license, all dockage fees, and all aquaculture lease payments. We will be seeking restitution." Whitaker's lawyer went white. Whitaker himself did something Emerson had not expected. He put his hand over his face, just for a moment, just one slow, exhausted gesture, and when he lowered it, he looked 10 years older than he had when he walked in. The confidence was gone. The overcoat suddenly looked too big for him. He was, she realized, just a man. An aging man who had made decisions a long time ago that he had perhaps once told himself were reasonable, and who had built the next 30 years of his life on the quiet agreement to never, ever look back at them. "Your grandfather," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter. "Your grandfather was the only man in this town who ever told me no and meant it. I never forgave him for it." He was looking at the table, not at her. "When he got sick, I thought the door had finally opened. Your grandmother signed the papers without reading them. Your mother signed because your grandmother asked her to. I thought that was the end of it. I genuinely thought for 10 years that I had won." He looked up at her. His eyes were wet, which surprised her. She had not thought he was a man capable of that. "I'm sorry, Miss Hale," he said. "For what it is worth at this late date, and from a man who does not deserve your hearing it, I am sorry." She did not forgive him. She did not have to. And she did not want to, and she was not going to pretend otherwise in a conference room in front of witnesses. But she nodded once, because a nod was the most honest thing she had in her at that moment. And she said, "My grandfather would have wanted me to hear that. So I heard it." The meeting ended without a settlement. There would be court. Peter Ansel told her afterward. There would be appeals, probably. There would be, in all likelihood, a year or more of unpleasantness. But the outcome was no longer in question. The deed was the deed. The family had won. The family had won 30 years ago. Actually, Silas Hale had won it quietly in 1979 at a registry counter with the help of a friend, and the victory had simply been waiting for someone to arrive and collect it. The year after that meeting was the hardest working year of Emerson's life, and also the happiest. Money did not arrive all at once. The legal process was slow, as Peter Ansel had warned, but the harvest license was hers immediately, and that alone was enough to change everything. She subleased a portion of it, carefully, on her own terms, to 2 local families who had been fishing the inlet for generations and who had been paying Whitaker's company for the privilege of working waters their own great-grandfathers had worked free. She cut their lease rates in half. She used the first quarterly income to begin repairs on the fishery. She did not hire an outside contractor. She hired Thomas Whalen, who knew how to frame a wall the old way, and 2 of his nephews who needed the work. She hired a young woman from town who had just finished trade school and could not find a job anywhere. She learned how to swing a hammer properly. She learned how to read a tide chart the way her grandfather had read one. She learned the names of every family who had ever worked that inlet, and she invited them back. The fishery was not rebuilt to be a museum of what it had been. It was rebuilt to be what her grandfather had always intended it to become, a working cooperative, where local harvesters could bring their catch, process it on share equipment, and sell it directly without surrendering half their margin to a middleman. Her grandfather's notes, folded inside the ledger, had included sketches for exactly this. He had never gotten to build it. He had left the plans for someone who would. in the spring. She painted the name back onto the side of the building, in the same blocky hand lettering her grandfather had used. Hale Fishery, EST 1889. The paint was yellow. It showed from half a mile down the inlet. Thomas Whalen came by on the day she finished. He stood on the dock with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the sign for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Your grandfather would be real proud, Emmy." "I hope so. I know so." He paused. "He used to say something to me. Near the end, he said, 'The water remembers the people who loved it.' Used to drive me crazy. I told him he was getting sentimental in his old age." Thomas cleared his throat. Turns out he wasn't being sentimental. He was making a promise. She did not say anything to that. She didn't have to. She just stood on the dock with him and looked out at the inlet, where a light chop was running in with the afternoon tide, and where two of the leased boats were coming home with their day's catch, and where the evening sun was laying a long, bright stripe across the water straight from the horizon to the pilings of her grandfather's dock. That night, she sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and read her grandfather's letter for the 12th time. She did it once a week now. It had become a ritual. She did not cry any more when she read it. She just sat with him, and she let the old, quiet voice of the man she had lost when she was 12 years old tell her, one more time, that the water was hers. The money, when the full settlement came through, was more than she had ever imagined any single person could possess. She set most of it aside. Some of it. She used to buy a small house at the edge of town, 2 streets back from the harbor, with a yard big enough for a garden. Some of it. She used to establish a trust in her grandfather's name, which would provide scholarships to any child from Harlow's Point who wanted to study marine biology, or fisheries management, or small-scale aquaculture. The trust would outlast her. She liked that. She kept the strong box on a shelf in her bedroom. She never locked it again. Whitaker left town the following year. He sold his chandlery. He resigned from the council. The official statement referenced health reasons. The real reason, Emerson understood, was simpler than that, and also more complicated. He had lived for a decade inside a story about himself, and the story had come apart in a single meeting, and a man cannot always stay in a place where the story about him is no longer the story he once told. He moved somewhere south. She did not follow the news of him. She did not need to. On the first anniversary of the day, she had walked into Jim Morrow's office with a crumpled $10 bill. Emerson went back down to the fishery at sunrise. She did not take coffee. She did not take a notebook. She just went and stood on the dock, the way her grandfather had stood on that dock 1,000 mornings before her, and she watched the light come up over the inlet. Her father had stood here, too, as a boy, squinting into a sun she had only seen in a photograph. She thought about the $10. She thought about how small it had looked on the counter, lying between her palm and Jim Morrow's. She thought about how in every story people told about this place from now on, the story of the girl who came back, the story of the old fox who had outfoxed them all, the story of the water that had remembered, that $10 bill would be the center of it, the smallest piece, the one everyone would remember. But that wasn't really the story. The story wasn't the $10. The story was a stubborn old man at a county registry in 1979, doing a quiet, careful, invisible thing, because he believed his family deserved better than what was coming for them. The story was a grandfather who had loved his granddaughter enough to leave her a letter she would not read for 11 years. The story was a piece of land that had been worked by people who loved it, holding what they had put in, until someone who knew how to look finally came home. She stood on the dock until the sun cleared the horizon. Then she turned, and she walked back up to the fishery, where a day of honest work was already waiting for her, and where the yellow paint of her grandfather's name caught the morning light and threw it back like a promise kept. Sometimes the decisions that look the most hopeless on the surface are the ones that carry the greatest hidden inheritance beneath them. When Emerson Hale spent her last $10 on a condemned fishery, it was not courage, and it was not strategy. It was the last move a life had left in it. And yet that exact moment, the lowest point of her life, turned out to be the door she had been walking toward for 23 years without knowing it. The truth is, not everything that is buried because it is worthless. Some things are buried because they were protected, some because a man who loved his family knew that the world was not ready to give them what was theirs. And so he hid it, and he waited, and he trusted that someone in the bloodline would come back. Some things wait exactly as long as they need to. Emerson didn't find gold at the bottom of a chest. She found her grandfather's hand, reaching across 11 years, holding out the thing he had kept safe for her. And in the end, that was worth more than any inheritance a bank could count. If this story stayed with you tonight, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your lowest moment might be the exact place where something your family set aside for you a long time ago is finally waiting to be found. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories on screen right now.